for my AP Lit class, AP Lang. Alrighty, so let's get started by just going through your new stabs. Okay, remember, when you're stabbing at something, when you're trying to identify a main idea, you have to have a thought, right? That's the most important thing. Later, we'll address the merits of that thought, but right now, you need to be expressing serious ideas that have consequences. You can't just toe the line. You can't just offload it all on the author. You have to critique and analyze this. So we're just going to go around the room. You're going to read your stab. Class, if you think it's a good stab, stab something in the air. If it misses the mark, just keep your hands down. So Georgia will start. If we like, Britt will start. If we like Brits, we'll go like this. If you don't like Brits, no movement. There we go. Ms. Buchanan, give us a stat.
Langston Hughes' story, Salvation, is about a boy who is saved from sin. As a 12-year-old boy, he feels pressured by other churchgoers to see God. The issue the boy has is that he can't see God. The stories his head was filled with caused him to believe that God was going to come to him personally to welcome him to his guidance. Also, the story that's not important. When the drunk son, Wesley, finally gave up in his efforts to see and feel God, and lied to the church saying he did, and the young boy Langston was the only one left. Langston felt ashamed and he felt obligated to lie to. Langston later that night cried because he knew what he did was wrong. But he now does not believe in God. And then I wrote, happiness comes from truth.
Okay. Where is her, I would say, beginning of a stab?
The very last.
The very last. Happiness comes from truth. If you need to write just about that as it relates to the story instead of giving us the beat by beat. Remember, you're summarizing a main idea. You are not walking us through a plot outline. Mr. Peterson, if you have a bunch of stuff written, only read the stab. That's all we're concerned about right now, stabbing. Mr. Peterson.
All right. Just the stab.
Just the stab.
All right. Sometimes in life you may seek out one ideal but receive the polar opposite.
And then, what?
He got the knife ready to go.
He's got the knife ready to go, but it's not yet ripping through the deer carcass. So that's a good start of an idea, a start of a stab. Play around with that idea as it relates to the story, and then you're in great shape. Does that make sense, Peterson? All right, bro.
All right. Hughes had an experience that he expected would bring him closer to Jesus and himself, but only push him further away. Sometimes what you want to happen doesn't, and you get the opposite.
What do we think, class?
Not quite as far as.
She's
like.
Yeah, she's describing
Yeah.
it.
She's start. Yeah.
She's picking
Okay.
it up.
Good. Yeah. Very fair. Started to put her hands around the knife, but have yet to really get into an aggressive posture. Ms. Cheney. Do you have a stab? Okay. Mr. Vane.
I don't think it's a great stab, but sure. In Langston's story, he makes a point that what truly comes from an experience can be different than what you expect, and consequently to your personal feelings.
Ooh. I thought after the and consequently, you were going to continue to come to a more broader conclusion instead of kind of coming back to what you mentioned before, consequently. Same boat as Peterson, right? Mr. Schottler.
The faults in this organized religion are really exposed, showing how everyone's spiritual experience is different. Hughes may have been able to get what he needed out of the church in a different social environment, but because he was forced into such an overwhelming environment, his faith in said religion was destroyed and he turned away from the church.
It's like a summary.
Read that one more time, a little louder, a little prouder. Class, pay attention.
I think it's stabbing.
The faults in organized religion, in this organized religion, are really exposed, showing how everyone's spiritual experience is different. Hughes may have been able to get what he needed out of the church in a different social environment, but because he was forced into such an overwhelming environment, his faith in said religion was destroyed and he turned away from the church.
The beginning is really.
Stab.
It's like the
No,
first, that's the first part.
Well, but this is what I've been trying to ask you guys to do. First part stabs, right? And then the second part develops how that stab is developed throughout the story. So instead of giving us like the beat by beat, which is what the Brit has done, he's given us the stab and then he frames the story under the terms of that stab. Does that make sense? That's good. That's a good thing. Here's the stat. Here, organized. Read the first part again.
The faults in disorganized religion are really exposed.
The faults in disorganized religion. And I guess if we were to be critical right now, we would say name the fault. Okay, or what is the fault instead of just saying the fault. So the faults are exposed, and then you state how that fault is exposed through Langston's stories. That's good. We like that. Ms. Mesker?
No matter what one does, what's expected, or what you believe is right, you cannot fit into the image perceived of you. Langston writes of his experience as a child that causes a separation of his social presence and his own sense of self. He lies to show that he belongs, which only furthers his break as he feels ashamed that he cannot honestly fit what is expected of him. He cannot fit into the belief of Christ because he was turned away, and if he does not believe, he does not fit with his own family.
So was that similar to Schottler's or similar to Peterson's?
Yeah, because it feels like she's trying to continue to.
So more similar to Schottler's or more similar to Peterson's? I would say more similar to Schottler's. Started off again with the idea, and then throughout the summary, it is the framing of that idea in the story. It was struggle with identity was your idea, right?
Yeah.
And then you talked about how the struggle of identity plays itself out in the story. Does anybody? We don't need to do this forever. Do we see kind of like the difference between and one that's just? Does anybody have one that they want to throw out there that they feel like they're particularly proud of over here on this side of the room?
I one that's wrote.
Do you feel good about it? You want to throw it out there?
I felt good about everything I said yesterday. Yeah, finding truth in oneself cannot be catalyzed by other people. You must find truth yourself.
Read that again, please.
Finding truth in oneself cannot be catalyzed by other people. You must find truth by yourself.
Catalyzed. Nice word. All right, stab or not a stab?
Yeah, his kind of has a stab, but I feel like it falls apart a little bit, but then he like gets back to it.
Falls apart a little bit, then he starts twisting again. Ms. Buchanan?
So this goes where you stab, and then you have to explain the stab in the story. That's what it is?
There's a variety of ways to do this. Okay, you can start by giving us the summary of the story in the terms of what you're going to come up with in the conclusion. So for his is about the faults in religion, right? As long as he starts off with a discussion of faults of religion in the story and then ends by crystallizing it and staying what the main point is, that's great. Or you can start off by saying, hey, here's the main point, fault of religion, and then discuss that throughout the story. Hale's got a stab, right? Read it again one more time.
Finding truth in oneself cannot be catalyzed by other people. You must find truth yourself.
You must find truth yourself. And his inability to find truth, right, is proof of what you're talking about because he doesn't know what he is himself, so he can't find truth. So there's a stab, and then if you framed the story through that lens, you'd be in great shape. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Your hand was popping up, Nelson, or not? No? Okay, super duper. Make sure your names are on your stabs. If you know what a stab is. If you have a stab in there, circle it, put stars around it so I know exactly what to look for. If you don't have a stab in there, don't turn it in. You're going to have some work time at the end. Make sure you get a stab. Miss,
Are we going to talk about the point of view?
we got to move on. Yeah, we're going to move on. I'm just going to make sure that you have that one done. So turn in your stab, turn in your POV, make sure your name's on that bad boy. And then, again, have all three of your stories out.
So, what could I say that would make my stab more stabby?
Say your stab again.
Hughes had an experience that he expected would bring him closer to Jesus,
Probably
but
the most
only push him further away.
Stab is inside.
Sometimes what you want to happen doesn't.
Yeah, honestly.
It.
If we're being
the last part is where you're trying to stab.
So that's the point is the stab.
That's where you're trying to stab. Isn't necessarily.
AP Lit and this has been in my mind around writing.
So,
AP Lit, we're doing kind of poetry stuff.
okay, so talk about a better stab would involve like the consequences or what causes that. to happen. Instead of just saying this thing happened, think about causes.
Yeah.
Saying stuff.
But isn't that like, so this is just like context, like
Yeah.
further detail?
Yes, further in detail.
Drag it out.
Like what, so again, can we talk through this?
And then you do
So should I
Why-
start with this and then go into
Yeah.
that?
Sometimes what you want to happen is the opposite. Okay, what's the effect of that? When you want something to happen and the opposite happens.
It's just like stuff further away and, yeah.
Yes. Then now we're savage. Now we're savage. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
I'll revise that.
Yep.
I gave.
This one.
What?
Down here, bottom. The resounding sense of guilt.
Yeah, I was in there.
Yeah, why don't you think it's okay? You should be able to let that go. You do good work there. Me, Alex. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So like
Because that would be pretty fire.
Yeah, it's the chairs, man.
Yeah.
Chris, I always like. I never
It's
repost this.
dependent on instructor, but there's no like infinite blade.
It needs to be seen by everybody.
Alrighty. Now, like I said before, we're working up to your first major assignment, which is going to be you writing a personal narrative. Now, we need to begin to think about the structure of a personal narrative, how a writer weaves together narrative and meaning, and what we can learn from the Dillard piece, what we can learn from Langston's piece, what we can learn from Shooting an Elephant, and how we might be able to apply that to our own writing. Okay, so first order of business, because it's second freshest in our mind. Langston Hughes. Okay, we talked about how did Langston Hughes start? So we got Langston Hughes, we got Ann Dillard, and we're going to end with George Orwell.
So we basically started with a one-sentence summary of the story.
What was the fancy word we used yesterday?
In medium.
Starts. So he starts in media res. Okay. Now the effect of that. Okay. What does him starting with the end do? We know it holds our interest, right? It gives us clues about what's going to happen. Now, when he started in media res, he didn't just say, "and I cried." He said, "I saved and I wasn't saved." So he's starting off in media res talking about the lesson or the main idea. Does that make sense? So he starts off in the middle, giving us a little nugget about.
Pardon the interruption. Jared Verhoevic, please come to the office. Jared Verhoevic to the office, please.
Sounds like you're
Giving us a little nugget about what's going to happen again at the end. Okay. Ann Dillard, how did she start?
Start talking about football.
She starts with the discussion of football.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we had to come up with kind of like a template to call that, we'd probably call that, she's like exploring an idea.
Yeah.
Right? She's exploring an idea in an interesting way. All right. And when she's talking about football, she's talking about it in a way that makes sense based on the climax of the story, right? Because the same thing she finds enjoyable about football is what she finds enjoyable about being chased by that guy later. So I'm not just starting with a random exploration of football. I'm starting with an exploration of something that is connected to the most important thing that would happen later. So if we think back for a moment to the paragraphs you wrote about something you enjoyed, Jet, you were writing about volleyball, right? Let's say that what is your most important moment related to volleyball? Just make something up if you don't have anything on top of your head.
I don't know, like I won a game.
All right, so Jet wants to write about a volleyball game that he won because that had significant personal meaning to him. Jet could, and what was so important about winning that game, Jet?
It was the state championship.
It was the state championship. So there were like hard consequences and there were nerves, right? So if Jet was writing about volleyball and like Ann Dillard wrote about being chased, Jet would want to start with a description of volleyball that starts introducing the idea of nerves and of pressure and performing under pressure. And that's going to come to fruition later in the story. Make sense? So as far as starting off our personal narratives go, we can start off our narrative in media res, and we're starting at the end talking about the main idea. We can explore an idea that is related to your main idea. Now, big old George Orwell. Hey, can't read it. You're going to have to listen to what I say. What are you wondering about, Georgia? What word? How does George Orwell start this bad boy? How does he capture your interest without using a quote or
kind of sets up the context behind why he's there in Burma,
And
why they
how he
dislike.
feels too.
So we have context
It's okay.
about situation. And what did you say?
Oh, how he feels about the situation.
So context, feeling, he's pretty much just giving you a big old overview of not just the situation. Use a more specific phrase.
People's reaction.
What?
People's reaction.
I mean, what is the
His point
situation?
of view,
His point of view as it relates to,
as it relates to the story.
this is the central conflict that plays itself out, or that's constantly in the background of the story, right? Him being a colonizer surrounded by colonizees. So he's not just giving us the overview of, hey, I'm in Burma and this is what Burma's like. He's exploring a conflict that is central to the story. So again, we go to Jet and winning state volleyball. What is the conflict that would be central to that story?
The nerves and stuff.
We could either go with the nerves
actual game.
or his opponent during, the opposition. It could start with the interesting description of the team that he's playing against. So these are three different ways in which you can start a personal narrative and have punch with your audience beyond just trying to start with a quote or just starting the story. So structure of our personal narrative. Now, Langston Hughes, he starts in media res, then he tells the story beat by beat, right? This happened, then this happened, then this happened. So we have the story. And where do we get the meaning or the stabbing from Langston? At the end. The end is where you have to understand the main idea, right? Or when the main idea is kind of like finally revealed and explored. So we start with media res. I was saved, but I wasn't saved. Here's the story. We have elements of humor. It's going step by step. And then at the end, Langston begins to explore the consequences of that story on himself as a person and on his worldview. So that's where he's exploring the main idea. Ann Dillard, what does she do?
Exploring idea. Near the end, but kind of in the middle. Oh, you're talking about when it is.
So Ann Dillard gives us this overview of football,
Yeah.
right? And then what happens?
It skips to a different slide.
So we jump ahead. So we fast forward in time. We flash forward. And then what does she do? So here's this general thing about football. Now jump to Christmas Day, right? And what's happening? She gives us the story again. And where does Anne begin to explore like main ideas?
Towards the end.
Towards the end again, right? Okay, so whereas Langston just kind of starts at the end with the end idea, then he jumps into the story, begins exploring his main idea, his central tension. His story is not just about going to church. It's a story about a guy who was saved but wasn't saved and that consequence on him. Ann Dillard It's not a story just about being chased. It's a story about wanting something more. It's about wanting conflict and how that conflict makes you feel alive. George Orwell starts with his context, gets into his story. Tell me what paragraph you feel like George reveals his main idea.
The last one.
See, the last one is there. There's one other one, though. The top of page 3, right? The one that starts, but at that moment I glanced around.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, so Orwell does something interesting. He jumps into the story. Then he gives us main idea. Then he finishes the story and then finishes discussing the main idea. Now, what is interesting about this in terms of its effect on the reader? In all of the other stories, the main idea wasn't really revealed until the very end. And then when we get to the very end, it's fine. We finally know what we're supposed to have been paying attention to. And that gives us a new perspective on what happened in the beginning and the middle. What's different about giving us the main idea before finishing the story?
Feelings.
What about feelings?
So you can get the emotion that he's feeling as it's happening.
It helps not only frame what's going on up here,
Yeah.
it gives you a heightened sense of what to be paying attention to down here as the story wraps itself up.
Wouldn't it be kind of like a weird form of like in media res? Because that's like a main idea preface the main idea at the end.
Right. Yes.
So you know what you're coming your way.
And yeah, it completely frames this. So yeah, it is in media res, just not necessarily at the absolute beginning, in the middle.
Yeah.
Does this make sense, class?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Ish. Makes sense, ish. Okay. So this is what you're going to need to be thinking about as you set out to craft your personal narrative. Again, formal assignment's not going to come before Friday or Monday. But when you do start writing, you need to think about how are you going to start your story, and then where are you going to put this interesting reflection on main idea. You have 3 wonderful examples of authors exploring main idea in different way. Langston Hughes, Ann Dillard, and George Orwell. All of them wonderful. Mr. Nelson?
I was just gonna ask if there's like a prompt or is it like just
There's going to be a formal prompt
okay.
that kind of helps set you up. But you're going to have to end up writing a story that functions in this sort of way. Now, again, in each of these stories, it is not just this happened, and this happened, then this happened, then this happened. What else is it?
It's the emotions. It's all the little fillers that weaken your perspective.
So yes. So it's not just the reporting of events, it's your attitude and feelings towards that reporting of events. But even more than that, all of these events are what? Towards the main idea. Everything that Orwell talks about. He's not just telling us this happened, then this happened. If you notice in that Orwell story, every time he talks about the Burmese people, how does he talk about the Burmese people? What'd you say? He's uncomfortable. And why is he uncomfortable?
He knows he's not well.
Yeah, it's through the lens of a colonist. So it's not just hey, here are these people. He talks about these people, talking about the conflict that's central to the story. His role as an outsider, their role as the native, and the conflict that exists between the two. I mean, his greatest fear is what? Being laughed at, right? Even though he's supposed to be big, bad colonist, the thing he's most afraid of is being laughed at. Everything he talks about in that story in terms of his relationship with those people is under the impressions of, is he going to be laughed at or is he not going to be laughed at? Jet, if he's writing about the state championship volleyball game, what is the central conflict there? If he's going to win or not, right? If that's what he was playing up. So every time he describes a point, what are the terms under which that point should be described? What?
Things that emphasize and frame the point.
So Jet doesn't just say so-and-so bumped the ball, so-and-so set the ball, so-and-so spiked the ball, and then I got a point. And then I served so-and-so bumped the ball, set the ball, spiked the ball, they got a point. It's not just merely a reporting of facts. I have to frame it.
It has to be mixed in with the emotions that he's feeling, what he's seeing around him. Also, like conflicts between the other team and his team.
Yes, how it's developing that conflict of ending the game or winning the game. It's not just a point. It's a point that has a consequence towards the conclusion of the game. Let's say that Jet was writing about the volleyball game and the central conflict was how he was overcoming his nerves or succumbing to his nerves. Then I'm not talking about points in terms of how well they affect the score. I'm talking about points how they affect what?
Mentality.
His mentality, his attitude towards what's going on, his ability to overcome something. You know, if we're writing about shooting a deer, right? What could be a central conflict talking about shooting your first deer? Your kid. So the emotional thing that goes into whether or not you're killing something. So maybe you were upset about having to kill an animal. So when you're talking about stalking the deer, putting the deer in your sights, pulling the trigger, it's not just those things are happening. It's how are those things happening as they relate to taking another life? What if he's worried about missing? You know, if I'm aiming, let's pretend like that, what is that? Water bottle. Vase. A water bottle is just a cap away from being a vase.
Pretty much.
Right? Okay. So if I'm taking aim at that deer, okay, and I want to talk about taking aim as though I'm having conflicts about taking the life of that deer, how would that sound? Mr. Lindenberg raised up his gun, and what? Yeah, maybe I would talk
how heavy it was in his hand.
the weight of what he was about to do, weighing in his hands. What else could we talk about? How else could we describe that?
Maybe you're getting sweaty or something like that because you're nervous. Yeah.
So it's what? Because I'm nervous. What'd you say? Hesitation. Gasped, held my breath. All these sorts of things are going to be emphasizing that I am concerned about taking the life of that deer. Now let's just say I'm nervous about missing because I want to impress my dad.
Your hands are trembling.
My hands are trembling. What else is happening?
You can't see through the scope perfectly. Like you can't get a good aim.
Yeah, and maybe I'm also constantly.
You're second guessing your aim.
You're looking over your shoulder because you're worried he's going to
Yeah.
Checking your dad.
Yeah.
Is he watching?
Easy what? Yeah. So these are the types of things that I would be paying attention to in that description. So the point is, you might want to write this down, or this is the important point to understand, is that when you're writing about the story, it's never just a beat by beat of what happened. You have to frame what's happening under the terms of your primary conflict, whatever it is you're trying to emphasize, whatever idea it is you're trying to emphasize.
Say that again.
You don't just report what's happening step by step or write about what's happening beat by beat. You have to write about what's happening under the terms of whatever your central conflict is or whatever your main idea is going to be. So that's a biggie in addition to thinking about how you want to frame your story. What I want you to do for tomorrow, and how many of you are leaving here in the next couple of minutes? Okay, what I want you to do for tomorrow, come back with this in tow. We're going to talk about some more things that we liked, and I'm going to ask you to write some more questions about Orwell. Also, what you have to come back tomorrow with, you have to stab this essay, Shooting an Elephant. What is Orwell's, you're going to have to finish it, Buchanan. Pull yourself together, finish reading it, take a stab at what is Orwell's main idea. That's thing number one. Thing number two, I also want you to come to class with a list of 5 to 7 events that have happened in your life that you consider to be important for whatever reason. You can think of it on as grand of a scale as life-changing. You can think of it as on small of a scale as making you think about something. But events that you consider to be important. Like for me, obvious one, big one would be birth of the son, marriage. I've had those big life events. Smaller ones, It could be, the first time I met Amber, my wife. It's an insane story, and I always look back on it and laugh, and also cry a little bit.
Oh.
It involves adult braces, a vulgar T-shirt, a pot, and a wooden spoon, and a football game. I'll tell it to you someday if you earn it. It's a good one. Yeah. Another small one could be, I don't know, when I killed a pocket gopher the other day, and that caused me to think about some things. Okay? It's a small event, but if it makes you think about big ideas, or even looking back on it, you can think about big ideas because of that small event. Put it on the list.
What if you can't think of it?
Then we'll continue to work hard on brainstorming. But just fake it till you make it. Think of stuff that could be important. Try to be profound.
What about events that are coming soon?
What-
Like a graduation,
Oh.
possibly.
Yeah. What specific part of preparing for graduation could you talk about that could give you an avenue? Like, so you would be going to school, right? And maybe while you're in school, you're reflecting on the impending. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
You have this for 20 minutes.
So, those of you that are sticking around, you can get your stab done before you leave, or at least you can get some feedback on your stab. And again, 5 to 7 things. Those of you that are leaving, make sure you come back with stab, 5 to 7 things. Be ready to talk a little bit more about George.
Lindenberg.
Can we turn in our staff from
Stab?
Yes.
yesterday?
Yep.
5 and 7 things. Simply stab. Few seconds.
Right.